Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone. I'm Todd Harrison, Director of the Aerospace Security Project here at CSIS. And it's my pleasure to welcome two very interesting, extraordinary guests, NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine and Susan Eisenhower, who is author of a recently published book on her grandfather, President Eisenhower, called How Ike Led. And today's discussion is going to be focused on really the Eisenhower administration's legacy in space in terms of civil and military space programs, and especially cooperation in space among various countries. So before we get started, I do want to go through quickly how to ask questions at the event. So you'll see down in your Zoom window at the bottom, there's a Q&A button. If you click on that, it will bring up a little box where you can see questions that others, that others are asking. And you can review those questions. If someone else has already asked the question that you'd like to ask, you can upvote that question. And if you don't see the question that you would like to ask, you can type that in yourself and submit it, and then we will see that question. And so we are going to be taking some questions from the audience. But without further ado, I do want to turn it over to you, Administrator Bridenstine, and you can kick off the event with kind of your thoughts on President Eisenhower and his legacy in space.
Well, thank you, Todd, so much, and thank you to the CSIS for hosting this, and thank you to Susan Eisenhower for joining us in this occasion. You know, a lot of people, I guess just last year we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Apollo program, and you know that was an amazing day. We had 500,000 people descend onto the National Mall to celebrate, and this was just on one day, to celebrate an event in history that was very positive. And you know, a lot of credit went to John F. Kennedy, and a lot of credit is due to John F. Kennedy for that event. But I think a lot of people might not realize, you know, the younger generations might not realize that none of that would have been possible if you didn't have a President Eisenhower who laid the foundation for this brand new agency in 1958 called NASA. And of course, he was responding to Sputnik. And the way he responded was very unique, because it would have been easy to dive into the media narrative or to dive into the political narrative about how you know, the Russians are putting weapons into space and those kind of things in those days. And instead what he said is, look, we need to, you know, advance this idea that space is open to everybody, and we need to send science to space. We need a space agency that is separate from the military industrial complex, a space agency that can bring partnerships. And so I know here at CSIS people are familiar with the dime theory of national power, and you know, the diplomatic power and information power and military power and economic power. The acronym DIME is something those of us that go through professional military education, you know, we get this a lot. But you look at what NASA is as an agency because of the legacy of Dwight Eisenhower, and we are a diplomatic agency. A lot of people don't realize, like, we've got all kinds of great experiments on the International Space Station from countries all over the world. And I think that's a real tool of diplomacy. It's also a tool of information. When we land, you know, a lander on Mars, the whole world sees it and celebrates it as humanity, not just as the United States, but as, look what humanity has done now. We were intentionally, by President Eisenhower, kept separate from the military. Not that we're less important at all. he thought we were extremely important as an agency, but he wanted it to be separate from the military because he wanted to be able to bring people together in unique ways that a military institution would not be able to do. And of course, we all know how important the E and dime, the economy is, and we look at all the things that we benefit today from space. We're communicating right now on a lot of people get internet broadband from space. So we're communicating to a lot of people right now via internet broadband from space. And of course, the camera that I'm looking into right now on my computer was a camera that was designed for a Mars mission back in the 90s. And now it's been licensed to all of these cell phone companies and all of these laptop companies, and it's used all over the world. So we think about the dime philosophy of national power. NASA plays a lot of roles there, and those roles are available because of the vision set forth by President Eisenhower. So I'm really excited about having this discussion, and I look forward to hearing from Susan Eisenhower, as somebody who knows these things better than anybody, and I look forward to asking her questions and getting into a dialogue, and certainly receiving some questions from the audience as well. Thank you, Todd.
And so, Susan, I want to turn it over to you. And given the research that you've done over the years with your most recent book, but also previous publications, tell us a little bit about President Eisenhower's approach to space, because he was there really, when humanity was first able to access this new domain. How did he view it, and what were his priorities?
Well, there's sort of two pieces to this. First of all, as General Eisenhower, nobody could have been more alert to the advances in rocketry than he was, because it was already becoming a very big problem in that war that Nazi Germany was using V1 and V2 weapons against Great Britain, and there was a lot of pressure that was created by that situation. In any case, again, as a military man, he would have been following all the technological developments that moved through, the pipeline between the end of the war into his own presidency. There's so many interlocking issues related to space, and the origins sort of come with the U-2 spy plane. It was an aerial reconnaissance effort to make sure that we were not subject to surprise nuclear attack. In 1955, at the Geneva Summit, Eisenhower offered the opportunity for the Soviet Union to overfly United States territory for the same reassuring reasons, but the Soviets were convinced that this was just a big excuse to get more targeting information, so they rejected the idea. In any case, space becomes extremely important with the dawn of the nuclear age, because it provided a higher ground from which to observe preparations for war and other critical national security issues. And one way to assure that the United States could use this capability was to establish the principle of freedom of space. This was not a foregone conclusion by any means. Many people thought that, unless something was done, the natural inclination would be to regard sovereign airspace as going out into outer space. And so it was an objective of the Eisenhower administration early on to do all that was possible to establish the concept of free access to space. And so in 1954, I think it was the International Councils of Scientific Unions established International Geophysical Year that was going to give the scientific community the opportunity to explore the great places on Earth, including Antarctica, but also they promoted the idea of launching artificial satellites. The United States signed on for that as a peaceful demonstration of what would be possible in terms of exploration, and then the Soviet Union followed suit right after that. Well, the extraordinary thing is about the Sputnik story is that so many people were well aware that not only the Soviet Union was busy building their artificial satellite, we were too. And it was well known to everybody in the scientific community anyway that there were even conferences about the fact that these satellites were going to be launched. As a matter of fact, the day before, let's see, it was on October 1st, the New York Times ran a front page story about a conference in Washington where the launch of artificial satellites were going to be imminent, and the Soviet Union confessed to that. Well, anyway, as we know, on October 4th, the world changed, and the Soviet Union put up, 183-pound gadget in space that went around the planet every 98 minutes. So, well, anyway, Eisenhower was then faced with a decision, which is one of them was to manage the public outcry, which was slow in coming, but it came in a forceful way by the end of October, but also to create a framework for the current event. It was very clear to Eisenhower, he knew that the Soviet Union was going to launch this satellite, and inside the administration, they were not at all unhappy that the Soviet Union had gone first for strategic reasons, because they introduced and then created a precedent for free access to space. There was the worry, of course, if the United States went first, that the Soviet Union might reject that outcome just as they had open skies. So let me end there by saying that's really the beginning of the story. Eisenhower responded to the public outcry, but also the political pressure. On the one hand, to try and calm everyone's nerves, but on the other, to take advantage of this moment to create some frameworks for the future through the National Defense Education Act, through the establishment of what was called ARPA, which became DARPA, and also this critically important founding of NASA. So, Mr. Administrator, if I may, or Todd, if you'd like to take it back from there, let's discuss this, the history of the founding of NASA together, but I hope that provided a little background.
Well, Administrator Bridenstine, back to you.
Yeah. I thank you, Todd. You mentioned ARPA, and that reminds me of a story that I think is really important and might be missed by a lot of people. After ARPA was established, the objective was to gain ground and match the Soviet Union when it comes to artificial satellites. And remember what Sputnik was, as you said, basically a steel ball orbiting the Earth every 98 minutes, and it was putting out little beeps and blips, and and it was fascinating to a lot of people, but also very concerning. What does this mean? And as you said, your grandfather established this open skies kind of effort. It didn't happen, and then all of a sudden we've got open space, and it's happening automatically, because when you're in space, you're in space. I mean, you're going to keep going around the Earth until you stop, and it doesn't matter what country you go over. But what's fascinating is ARPA started a project called SCORE, which was in essence a one-upsmanship kind of thing with the Soviet Union. It was the world's first communication satellite, dedicated voice communication satellite. And of course, President Eisenhower had this desire to be, open up the skies, open up space, and make sure that your territorial boundaries don't prevent people from being able to fly into space. And so he took advantage of it. He didn't try to prevent the Soviets. He said, okay, we're going to do the same thing. We launched SCORE, and what's fascinating is the day before it launched, President Eisenhower wanted to have his voice on that satellite. And so he made the effort. He said, look, I want my voice. It was going to be the Secretary of the Army. And nobody knows what that message would have been had it been the Secretary of the Army. I don't know. Maybe somebody out there knows. But when they launched the satellite, it had the voice of the Secretary of the Army, and that was the voice people were going to hear around the world. And President Eisenhower wanted a different message, a different voice. He wanted it to be the President of the United States. And so he got involved And the day before the launch, like this thing is buttoned up. It's an Atlas rocket and it's about to fly. And you're not going to open that sucker up and start changing, the communication capabilities inside there. So what they did is they launched it with the message from the Secretary of the Army, and then once it was in space, they erased it and put in President Eisenhower's voice. And I want to just share for the audience what the message was, because I think it really speaks to what his philosophy was at the time. Here, I'm pulling it up right here. His message was this: remember, first time anybody has ever heard a human voice communicating from space. And it's going from one ground station up to a satellite, and then it's being released to a whole lot of ground stations on the planet. So this is over-the-horizon communications, a critically important capability today for the military. And the first voice that ever was heard was President Eisenhower. This was his message. His message was, "This is the President of the United States speaking. Through the marvels of scientific advance, my voice is coming to you from a satellite circling in outer space. My message is a simple one. Through this unique means, I convey to you and to all mankind America's wish for peace on earth and goodwill toward men everywhere." I find that it's a Christmas message: peace on earth and goodwill toward men everywhere. It was a Christmas message during Christmas time, and it was President Eisenhower whose voice was transmitted around the world. I just think that's an amazing story. And that was an ARPA project. ARPA, of course, being a project of President Eisenhower, along with NASA, along with the FAA. I mean, this is a legacy that I think is critically important. So I'm really excited about that. I'm really excited about the Eisenhower Memorial, actually. And I know Susan has been working day and night on this project for many years. But Susan, tell me, when you think about the legacy of where we were then in that Sputnik moment, where you have all of these voices, political and media and pressure, and your grandfather had a vision that was different, that he was able to withstand the pressures to do something that would have exacerbated the situation, and instead he went a different direction. How do you see that today? I mean, these kind of, that decision back in that day has an impact all the way up to today. Tell me how you see it.
Well, thank you. I'd like to just add something here, that it was clear that the United States could have gotten a satellite into orbit before the Soviet Union, but that was a military project called Jupiter-C, and Ike did not want to slow up the development of that program by having it sidelined with the Vanguard project. But more importantly, the exercise brought by IGY, International Geophysical Year, called for the peaceful orbit of satellites, and he wanted to have a firewall between the two. That was certainly his desire. So I think, and by the way, thank you for reading that wonderful voice recording from space, because I think it's very meaningful. Eisenhower really believed that it wasn't enough to say you wanted to have peace, that you had to show it, and you had to show it on a regular basis, and that is such a big part of a number of his policy decisions. In any case, as we go in today, probably not that dissimilar. There are always voices coming from many quarters, always questioning the priorities established by any administration. And I'm sure, though I'm not privy to it, that there are similar pressures today. But I remain a resolute fan of NASA. I was from the moment I was a kid all the way till now. And I had the enormous privilege, Jim, of serving on the NASA Advisory Council I'm not sure, I did multiple terms. I'm not sure if it added up to 10 years or 12 years. And I had the honor to serve on the International Space Station Management and Cost Evaluation Task Force, and to work closely with NASA in helping to identify with some of the contacts I had to specific Russian engineers who could be helpful on that project. In any case, the space station today, if you think about it, is a miracle. From a diplomatic point of view, there was a lot of angst in the beginning of that project about would we be learning enough science up there to justify the cost. And I would certainly argue, and have done so in congressional testimony, that we more than got our money back for this space station because of the extraordinary diplomatic capability of that station on orbit. And then you think about the other remarkable things now we're doing scientifically in looking into the origins of the universe and other projects like that. So how many countries, by the way, did you say have been on station? And you offered a number, which I thought was really quite extraordinary, but I've forgotten it now.
Yeah, no, it's good. We have 15 nations that operate the International Space Station. We've had astronauts from 19 different countries, and we've had experiments from 103 different countries. And currently, and that's just the International Space Station. If you look agency-wide with all of our robotic missions to Mars, and Pluto and other places, Earth missions, Venus, a lot of news coming out about Venus recently, solar missions, we've got missions at the sun. If you add up all of our different missions on the science side, we have over 700 active agreements with nations all over the world. So over 700 active, obviously not 700 nations, but 700 agreements with nations all over the world for those kind of experiments. And again, that is the legacy of making sure that NASA was separate from the Department of Defense, and a tool of diplomacy. I think that's the big takeaway, is that it really is a national power capability, a soft power capability. Mm-hmm. It's science, it's discovery, it's exploration. But we're able to have partnerships now that we couldn't otherwise have. And next month in November, I should say 2 months, we're going to be celebrating 20 years of American astronauts and Russian cosmonauts living and working together in space. We have all these terrestrial challenges, and we're not dismissing the importance of any of that by any means. But in the midst of that, we still have this diplomatic channel, this channel of communication that gives people maybe a bit of hope that there can be dialogue that resolves issues rather than conflict. And I think that's really where President Eisenhower's philosophy was, and it's paying dividends today. And of course, he was the wartime general that won World War II, and he didn't want to go through another event like that. And I think that's why he was so focused on the tools of diplomacy when he was president.
Well, that's right. I mean, obviously, we're living in a very contentious time. And there is a lot of stress on the international system. So I think it's absolutely vital that there is something that's on orbit that signals a sense of hope for the world. I must say, I should have probably prefaced my earlier remarks when I started working on the space station. I was serving as an analyst and a journalist and other things during those years in the Soviet Union. I was a member of the National Academy of Sciences Standing Committee on International Security and Arms Control, which is why I knew, quite a large number of people who worked in this area. And Jim, you might be interested to know that at least this was widely felt, but one Russian said to me, you know, NASA is, we all envy NASA, and how we wish we had an agency that ran our space program like that, because of course in the Soviet Union it's all military related. And he said that, you know, an organization that is established for peaceful uses only can actually investigate things that go wrong from an engineering point of view without it becoming an issue of classification and national security. And so that really gave NASA an enormous leg up when things needed to be investigated and fixed. And this is just not something that other countries have the capability of doing. And I thought that was a really interesting point. And I also can say, after all those years, that the NASA way of doing things and the NASA culture really did change the way the Russians thought about a lot of this. And I know even from an engineering point of view, we learned some things from them too. So it was really a wonderful way of influencing some key players on that side.
And
Absolutely.
jump in here quickly. We actually have a question from by email that I think directly relates to this. It's for you, Administrator Bridenstine. You know, given the clear, you know, heavy emphasis that President Eisenhower put on international cooperation in space, and that was core to the reason that NASA was founded and was separate from our military space programs. The question here is, how do you respond to criticism that that spirit of cooperation in space has atrophied over time, particularly with respect to Russia and China? You know, with all of what we see these countries doing, expanding their military ambitions in orbit, what do you see as the future of international cooperation in space for NASA?
Yeah, so really, going back to Eisenhower's legacy of establishing this norm of behavior, that you can overfly nations in space. The key is it established a norm of behavior, and we did it using a message of peace, which I think is absolutely fascinating. We weren't trying to scare anybody. We were just trying to respond, demonstrate technological prowess, and have a message of peace. And President Eisenhower made that happen. I think the other thing is, we look at what we're doing today under the Artemis program. We're going back to the moon sustainably with commercial partners, international partners. We're going to learn how to live and work on another world for long periods of time. We're gonna take that knowledge from the moon and we're going to go to Mars. That program, the Artemis program, is extremely popular all around the world. We had a meeting little less than a year ago, and we invited all the nations of the world to come and share with us, you know, what they would want to do if they were part of the Artemis program. We had 26 nations from around the world come to a meeting. And of those 26 nations, a good chunk of them don't even have space programs, but they wanted to be a part of this. Of course, all the 15 nations that operate the International Space Station, they were all there. But then there was all these other countries that don't, in many cases, even have a space program. But here's the thing: all of a sudden, we look at how space now is starting to be contested. It's not starting; it is. Yes, there are nefarious actors out there that are doing things that are destabilizing, space in general. And because of that, we have had to take action as a country to establish things like the Space Force and reestablish the U.S. Space Command and things like that. But at the same time, because NASA is this independent agency that is not part of the Department of Defense, these nations come to us and say, hey, we want to be part of your program. And we can say to them, okay, you want to go to the moon, we want to go to the moon, we're all going to the moon. But here are some norms of behavior that you need to adhere to. Because you cannot have a human spaceflight program and intentionally create space debris and intentionally, launch, anti-satellite missiles that are going to permanently damage space. And so it gives us, it goes back to that soft power. It gives us a tool of leverage to compel responsible behavior. And if we didn't have a civil agency where people felt comfortable being a part of something like this, we couldn't establish those norms. Now, how does that relate specifically to the U.S. Space Command or Space Force? Here's how it relates. In warfare, you have to be able to know what the rules are, so that you know when something is hostile intent or a hostile act. We see it on the open seas all the time. There's a 500-foot bubble around any ship on the sea. If you break that, there's a whole series of events that take place. Those kind of norms of behavior don't exist in space, and they need to. We're getting to the point now where we absolutely need to have norms, rules, standards that need to be adhered to, and if you don't adhere to that, there has to be a consequence. And I think our peaceful exploration of space, which everybody wants to be a part of, everybody wants to go to the moon, everybody wants to go to Mars. You want to be a part of it with the United States, we're going to lead. We will absolutely lead, but we need you to adhere to these basic norms of behavior so that we can eventually one day be able to determine the difference between an accident, hostile intent, and hostile act. So I really think there's a soft power, hard power kind of synergy here that makes all of us more secure.
And Susan, back to you on this. I'm noticing in the Q&A here, there's several questions that relate to President Eisenhower's views on the military uses of space. And the premise of some of the questions is that Eisenhower didn't think it should be a domain for military expansion or military uses of space. But, what's the ground truth on this? How did President Eisenhower, we know he wanted the peaceful civil side of space. What were his views and what actions did he take on the military and intelligence side of space that we should be aware of?
Well, it's a very interesting thing. I pay attention to words, right? I just wrote a book and I love words because they imply all kinds of meanings. Actually, space has been militarized, since the Eisenhower administration, but he did not support weaponization, which is different than militarization. And militarization is not a negative thing in this context. It was they were reconnaissance satellites. They were there to verify the activities of other countries preparing for war and surprise nuclear attack. But these were, and they were run by the military, but this was not weaponization, which is certainly an issue that has come up countless times anyway in the last 20 years. I worked on that issue myself a number of years ago. So I think that's probably the way we have to think about it. The Corona project, which was started at the end of that administration, was extremely important and was regarded as a stabilizing mechanism to assure that that we weren't subject to what I called paranoid uncertainty, which I think is a great line because that's what happens when you don't know what the state of play is. And so that militarization might actually be seen as another effort towards peace.
And Administrator Bridenstine, another question for you from the audience here is, why has civil space cooperation been so resilient over the decades, particularly with US and Russia, even though our relationship has had its ups and some downs more recently? Nevertheless, our partnership with Russia on the space station has been, pretty much unaffected by this. What do you think is the reason for that resilience that we've seen?
I think there's a couple of things. I mean, if you just look nuts and bolts, I mean, each of our nations has invested, billions of dollars. In our case, I think it's over $100 billion at this point into this asset. And of course, I don't know what the Russian investment is, but it's pretty hefty as well. So we've invested all of this money. We've got all of these activities that are underway. And these kind of projects are multi-decadal in nature. Like I said, we're coming up on 20 years of permanent human presence off the Earth, 20 years, which is amazing when you think about it. And so that in itself makes it difficult to, even if you wanted to, you're going to go out and cancel the program. I mean, it just doesn't make sense from an investment perspective when it's not doing any harm. You know, what would be the reason to cancel it after all of the investment that's been made and all of the scientific progress that's still being made? I think it's an extremely resilient capability because it's not doing harm, and a lot of money has gone into it. I would also say it helps that you know, there's 15 nations that have made investments like this. You know, there was a day, I don't remember what the year was. There was a day when the International Space Station was about to not get funded, and what prevented it from going down, it came down to a vote on the floor of the House. It came down to one vote, and the international partners were the ones that were lobbying members of Congress. I think that is another reason that it is so resilient. So the international partnerships make it resilient. The return on the investment makes it extremely resilient. The capital outlays that have already been gone into it make it very resilient. So, and the question is, it's an example of a sustainable program. That's what the International Space Station is. You know, we all love Apollo. It's, you know, this iconic moment in American history where Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong landed on the moon. The problem with Apollo is that we landed on the moon 6 times and then it ended. And, you know, the question is, what can we learn today about resilient programs? I think the International Space Station is a perfect example. And when we build the Artemis program, the President's Space Policy Directive 1 says we're going to go to the moon sustainably. We're going to go to stay. And so we need to take the lessons of the International Space Station and apply those to our moon program. So the partners would be international, but they would also be commercial. You know, in the Apollo era, there was no commercial programs either. So I think that there's more capability today for resilient programs than even in the past.
And Susan, you know, back to you. You know, at the time, you know, we were obviously in the, you know, the depths of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. You know, did Eisenhower, you know, face political backlash for wanting to, you know, reach out to the Soviets for potential cooperation in this new domain? And, you know, how did he kind of square that circle of, we're going to compete with the Soviets, you know, geopolitically, but we're also going to cooperate with them selectively through things like civil space programs? How did he rationalize that within his administration and with the public?
Well, he was, how is he rationalizing that? The same way he rationalized everything else, which is to say that he was playing what I call the long game. And the long game is to get the architecture set up in a certain way that we would have. I loved the administrator's word, sustainability. I believe we ought to give this a hashtag or something, a strategic sustainability. He didn't think it was a good idea for us to be in negotiating every year and canceling programs every year, starting programs every year. We needed to have some architecture for the future. And so the backlash was pretty severe, actually, even for the way the IGY contribution was made. Actually, the level of hysteria, if you read what people were saying, it was completely bizarre. They were saying things like, well, if the Soviet Union put up Sputnik, obviously we've lost the Cold War, and dire predictions, mixing up actually, you know, the difference between the rocket that delivered those primitive satellites into orbit versus ICBMs that require sophisticated guidance systems, et cetera. So that conversation rapidly moved to missile gap theories and all of the rest of it. And of course, any idea of cooperating with certain countries in the context of those public debates that were underway just was a non-starter. But the whole, again, NASA was part of the architecture for making sure that cooperation would be important in the future. And then let me just finally stand back and say what I think I've done in my book, How Ike Led. I hope that by the end of it, I have demonstrated that Dwight Eisenhower, the general, was the same person as Dwight Eisenhower, the president. And so I think a lot of times the scholarship, whether it's on this issue or something else, gets a little muddled because they're only looking at this from one of his job's perspective. And what is really remarkable to me when I did my research is how much of his mental process about how to make decisions and solve problems that were honed during the war, he brought with him into the presidency. Let me tell you, he was a wonderful man. Trust me on this. I want no argument on that subject. But you don't have to necessarily agree with his decisions, but he had a thought process. He believed in study. He believed in planning. He put the architecture together in his own White House to make sure that he could withstand the heat when it came. And your listener's question, applies to that context. He stood up against really a firestorm of criticism in the post-Sputnik era and the missile gap era. And he was fully confident that because of his planning and his study and everything else they'd poured into this, that America was as secure as it ever had been.
And Administrator Bridenstine, back to you. I know at a previous talk we had with you, you went through the whole dime construct of diplomatic, informational, military, economic sources of national power and where NASA can play a role. In each of those, we've joked before, I think that it's dime with a lowercase m, because NASA doesn't do much in the military, but it does a lot in terms of diplomatic, informational, and economic national power. Are we at a moment now, is NASA at a moment, is the nation at a moment where it's time for another big, bold move like that in international space cooperation? And is the Artemis program, is that the vehicle to do it?
Yes, 100%. We look at what we're doing with the Artemis program. We're using it to establish norms of behavior in space that represent American values. And when I say American values, these are not values just unique to America, but the things that we hold dear as far as openness when it comes to science. Another legacy, you think about Eisenhower and what he did with the Antarctica Treaty, for example, and attempting to bring the Soviet Union into an agreement on Antarctica based on science. He was using science to compel behaviors that would be acceptable from a military perspective. We didn't want Antarctica to become weaponized, and we didn't want nuclear weapons there. So we used science to create the norms of behavior that prevented that from happening. And that's a legacy of Antarctica. It's also the legacy of NASA and space. And I think we're benefiting from that even today. And when we go to the moon, again, we're going to establish norms. The Artemis Accords that NASA has laid out and has shared with the State Department, and we're working with state and nations around the world, are establishing norms of behavior for the moon. And we just recently, a couple of weeks ago, announced that we're doing we just put out an RFP to buy lunar resources because we want commercial companies to be able to put their own sweat, their own equity into extracting a resource and then be able to sell it, trade it. Establishing once again a Western value of free enterprise, and applying it beyond our borders. And those are the kind of things that ultimately, if we can establish those principles and take them beyond our borders, it results in peace. And when we think about what President Eisenhower did and how it's meaningful today, the criticism I just heard Susan talk about. Yes, there's criticism, but it can't be argued that he stood on principle for what he thought was right. The criticism is from the loudest voices that can grow their own power by being critical. It wasn't because those voices were strategic. Those voices were attempting to gain power for themselves. And that's very different than the way Eisenhower operated. He operated in an extremely thoughtful, I loved how Susan said, study. Like that is the number one key thing for anybody in a leadership position, study, 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 study. And I love that she brought that up.
And, you know, in terms of the announcement that you had made a couple of weeks ago about NASA buying the lunar resources from a company, you know, immediately people start wondering, okay, is this actually in full compliance with the Outer Space Treaty that says nations can't claim territory? They can't claim sovereignty over any celestial body. You know, walk us through your thinking about that and how you're maintaining that existing norm while setting a new norm.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, you can't own the ocean either. Nobody owns the ocean. But if you apply your equity and your sweat and your effort to extract tuna from the ocean, guess what? You can own the tuna. If you apply your effort to extract energy from the ocean, you can own the energy. And then it becomes a private property right. You own the resource that you extract, even though you cannot appropriate the ocean for national sovereignty. You can own resources from the ocean. And that principle, that international norm, which is now binding international law, should apply to the moon as well. The Outer Space Treaty specifically says you cannot appropriate the moon or other celestial bodies for national sovereignty. Well, just because you extract a resource does not mean that the United States of America has claimed the moon for its own. But what we do have to have, just like in the ocean, we have to have the rules. And so when I'm flying an F-18 over, you know, the Gulf of Mexico, or an F-18 in the Persian Gulf, you know, I'll get queried by people, queried by different nations, and they'll say, you know, they'll interrogate me. And the answer is always, look, I'm a sovereign U.S. naval aircraft operating due regard over international waters. Those two words, due regard, are critically important. I won't interfere with you. You don't interfere with me, and everybody's going to be just fine. Operating due regard, you've got to use those words. So when we go to the moon, we need to operate due regard on basically a not interfere basis. And that interference is physical, but it's also, you know, use of the electromagnetic spectrum and, you know, all of those other kind of things that are important. But you know, I think when we do this kind of activity, it is 100% in compliance with the Outer Space Treaty. We fully support the Outer Space Treaty. And by the way, when I was in the House, we put this into law. So we actually put, you know, the Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act is a law that says you can own the resources from the moon in compliance with the Outer Space Treaty. It was passed bipartisan in the House, passed bipartisan in the Senate, signed by President Obama. And so this is not something that I just did last week. This is something that's been on my mind. That we passed that bill back in 2015. And we're not doing this, you know, haphazardly. We're doing it to establish a strategic framework from which nations can operate on the surface of another world, in this case, the moon.
All right, and I want to shift gears a bit. There's a question from the audience here. Really, I think it's for you, Susan. The question is, can you speak to the importance of domestic policies, especially relating to the civil rights movement, in shaping Eisenhower's space policy and foreign policy priorities, and how that history might help current policymakers navigate the current climate that we see going on in the country, and while they're establishing new space policy priorities?
Well, I'm, you know, first of all, I just want to say, well, I don't know if I'm going to actually get to this question specifically because I'm not exactly clear how civil rights, I can think of one way that civil rights combined with space, and I'll say something about that in a minute, but this idea of dime also has echoes of Eisenhower's legacy. In his day, he called it the Great Equation. And as far as I know, he was one of the very first presidents to talk about the economy and our military capabilities and our moral authority as the three pillars of our national security. It's called the Great Equation. And this had a lot to do with assigning priorities to things. But as you see in the Great Equation, it has a domestic element to it, because a strong economy, of course, is vital if you're going to advance your interests in foreign policy. But it's also critical to providing the capabilities for America to be strong domestically. And so that's where I probably see the connection points. I have to say, on a personal basis, it's fascinating that the Little Rock crisis in 1957 was literally just weeks before Sputnik went up. And so suddenly the president had two wildly different types of challenges on his docket. And, you know, I did a lot of research in Aid's memoirs and the rest of it. And the one thing that they all said was that because he really did adhere to principled leadership, he had a way of stripping down complex issues and thinking about what the key thing was. So, of course, in civil rights, he argued civil rights on rule of law because he knew that was the one thing that everybody could agree on. And he knew he had 8 years to make civil rights progress. And by the end of his administration, the administration had desegregated virtually everything controlled by the federal government, which was part of his strategy. So he had a strategy for space as well. This was a strategic thinker, and he, you know, found it, you know, important to think about the principles involved before he began to wind things out, because again, he was looking for some kind of a strategic approach. So I'm not sure that exactly answered the question, but Dime has great hints at, of the earlier time when it was called the Great Equation. And I'm proud to say that for all the things he did in space and all the developments like ARPA, as we discussed earlier, and the beginning of reconnaissance satellites and U2, and that's in the military sphere, but all the things he did domestically, building an interstate highway system, acquiring Hawaii and Alaska and Antarctica, and it goes on and on. He balanced the budget 3 times in 8 years, got close on another 2, and left the next president, John F. Kennedy, with a surplus. And so that was all part of this great equation where actually domestic things and international things are very much linked.
Hey, Todd, can I ask a question here?
Absolutely, go ahead.
I want to put Susan on the spot.
Sure.
Tell us your thoughts on the relationship between Dwight D. Eisenhower and Lyndon Baines Johnson.
Uh-huh. Oh, I'm so glad you mentioned that, Jim. I think this is very, very interesting. Now, just think about this. When Eisenhower was elected in 1953, the Republicans controlled the House and the Senate by little teeny margins, okay? But the point is that the Republicans were back. They had not been in power since the Great Depression. And that was a huge job that Eisenhower had to rebuild the party and actually turn it into a party that believed in internationalist ideals. Then, of course, for the next 6 years, the Democrats controlled the House and the Senate, and Lyndon Johnson was the leader of the Senate. And it's amazing when you look at how many issues they cooperated on because of their personal relationship, space being one of them, and by the way, civil rights too. Even though Eisenhower wanted a much more robust 1957 Civil Rights Act, by the way, the first president to pass a piece of civil rights legislation since the Reconstruction era in our country. When it got to the objections of the Democrat-held Senate, they wanted to take out the voting rights section, by the way, of Eisenhower's legislation. But it's with Eisenhower and Lyndon Johnson who broker a deal. And then on space, the same thing happened. The Senate had its own bill for the establishment of what we knew was an agency that had to be formed, and they worked together closely. So I think that's really, if we are going to unveil an Eisenhower Memorial tomorrow, how appropriate it is that the Eisenhower Memorial is next to the Lyndon Baines Johnson building. And that the two of them, I did a pretty good job of not trying to take away attention from this other partner of a different political party. And so I think it's one of the fascinating parts of that era that despite all of the turmoil and upheaval and technological change, that these two parties, when it came to important things, could work together.
So we're almost out of time here. Last question to you, Administrator Bridenstine. Speaking of politics, you know, we are in an election year. And, you know, there obviously is a chance that there'll be a change of administration next year. Do you see that, you know, that there is bipartisan support building for the Artemis program? Do you think it would continue in a new administration? And what kind of groundwork are you laying right now in case you do have to hand that over to a different team?
Yeah, no, this is an important question. The President's Space Policy Directive says to build a sustainable program. That means sustainable in my view and in his view is sustainable. We're going to go to the moon to stay, which means we have to have bipartisan consensus. It has to be able to span multiple presidencies going for the next, 50 years. And so bipartisan consensus is critically important. We work on it every day. I've always said, wherever there's division, when it comes to space exploration, when it comes to science, wherever there's division, we can get rid of it. We have the ability to do that. When I was in the House, it was crazy. You had Republicans that wanted to go to the moon and Democrats wanted to go to Mars, and therefore none of us went anywhere. I mean, it's just the silliest kind of divisions. Republicans were for human space flight, and Democrats were for robotic space flight through the Science Mission Directorate. And so guess what? Our budgets never grew. Our programs were stagnant. Make no mistake, we did good things during that time as an agency, but it just wasn't where it could have been. And those kind of artificial divisions that get created because somebody makes a declarative statement, and then again, it's in the interest of the other party to make an opposite declarative statement just to create the division for their own power. Those kind of things we have to eliminate. And so it's not the moon or Mars, it's the moon and Mars. It's not human exploration or robots, it's both. And so we've had a lot of success, just for example, since 1972, we have not had a human landing system funded to go to the moon, not since 1972. We've had presidents declare it before, nobody's funded it. President Trump has funded it. We have bipartisan support through his budget request. We have bipartisan support in the House, bipartisan support in the Senate. For the first time since 1972, we actually have a human landing system funded. We have 3 human landing systems under development. And now the House of Representatives, which is controlled by Democrats, they have put on their own appropriation bill $600 million for a human landing system that is part of this program. So the bottom line is, I think people believe remember, we are going to the moon to stay, and we have to have bipartisan support. And so I'll tell you, it's something I work on every day, and I'm very proud to say that Republicans and Democrats agree that we need to go to the moon. I'm the first NASA administrator in history that wasn't alive when we had people living and working on another world. That's a failure of our country. We've got to make sure that doesn't happen again. And we're making great progress. And again, it's only going to happen with bipartisan support. So thanks for that question.
All right. And thank you both for this excellent discussion. And, we look forward to seeing you more in the future, having you back at future CSIS events. But I want to thank you all and thank the audience for chiming in with questions and for staying with us through this discussion. So everyone, I hope you have a nice day.